A routine traffic stop. A white officer full of prejudice. A black woman quietly obeying his commands. Until she made one call that flipped the entire situation. The moment he realized who her husband was, his face turned pale. What happened next left the whole street speechless. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the quiet suburban streets. The roads were smooth, the houses pristine, the kind of neighborhood where everything seemed in its place. Except, apparently, for her. She drove with ease, her hands steady on the wheel, the soft hum of the engine blending with the faint music playing through the speakers. She had just wrapped up a long day at work, the weight of meetings and deadlines still lingering in her mind. Dressed in a tailored navy blue blazer and slacks, she exuded quiet confidence. Someone who belonged in a boardroom, not in the middle of an unnecessary traffic stop. But as she approached a stop sign, the sudden flash of red and blue in her rearview mirror made her heart tighten. The sound of a siren, sharp and commanding, cut through the calm afternoon air. She exhaled slowly, pulled over, and watched the white police officer step out of his vehicle. He moved with a casual arrogance, his hand resting near his belt, his expression unreadable, but his intentions clear. This wasn't just about a routine check. She knew this look. She had seen it before. He leaned down to her window, eyes scanning the interior of her car, before settling on her face. "License and registration," he said flatly. No explanation, no greeting, just a demand. She didn't argue. She reached for her purse, moving carefully, making sure her motions were deliberate. She had learned long ago that any sudden movement, no matter how innocent, could be misinterpreted. She handed him the documents, keeping her voice calm. "Is there a reason you pulled me over, officer?" He took the papers from her, his lips curling slightly. "Just a routine stop," he said, but his eyes told a different story. She knew what this was. She wasn't speeding. She hadn't run a stop sign. Her car was in perfect condition, registration up to date. There was no reason for this stop, except for the fact that she was a black woman driving through a neighborhood where, in his mind, she didn't belong. The silence stretched as he examined her license, flipping it between his fingers like it was a game. Then, without looking up, he asked, "This your car?" There it was. She felt the familiar sting of frustration creeping in, but she kept her voice measured. "Yes, it is." His smirk deepened, like he was waiting for her to get defensive, waiting for her to slip up and give him a reason to escalate. "You live around here?" he pressed. She could feel her pulse in her fingertips. She could tell he wasn't expecting a yes. "Actually," she said smoothly, "I do." That seemed to annoy him. He clicked his tongue, glancing over the car once more, searching for something, anything, that could justify prolonging this stop. He took a step back, nodding toward her trunk. "Pop the trunk for me." It wasn't a request. She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Why?" "Ma'am," he said, his tone condescending. "Are you refusing to comply?" She let out a slow breath. She had a choice. Argue and risk escalating the situation, or handle this another way. She reached for her phone, her fingers moving effortlessly to dial the one number she knew would end this faster than any argument ever could. The officer chuckled, shaking his head. "Calling your boyfriend to come save you?" She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice steady, deliberate. "Hey, love," she said, her words carrying an edge of amusement. "A police officer just pulled me over. He doesn't seem to have a reason, but he's asking a lot of questions." A pause. Then, her voice turned just a shade sharper. "Would you like to have a word with him, Chief?" The moment the word chief left her lips. A flicker of something crossed the officer's face. Confusion, maybe, or the first whisper of doubt. But it was gone just as fast as it came. He scoffed, arms crossing over his chest, his confidence unshaken. "Chief, huh?" He tilted his head, eyes narrowing as if he was trying to read her. "That's supposed to scare me?" She didn't respond. She didn't need to. Instead, she held the phone out toward him, her expression unreadable. "He'd like to speak with you." For the first time since he pulled her over, hesitation flickered in his stance. He looked at the phone, then back at her, before letting out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Yeah, no thanks. I don't take orders from someone's boyfriend over the phone." Her lips curved, just slightly, just enough. "Suit yourself," she murmured before pressing the phone back to her ear. "He doesn't want to talk," she said, her voice carrying a quiet amusement. There was silence on the other end, a loaded silence. Then, finally, a voice. Calm, steady, but laced with an authority that made even her sit up a little straighter. "Put me on speaker." She did. The voice that filled the air was the kind that demanded attention without needing to raise itself. "This is Chief Parker of the Internal Affairs Division," the voice said smoothly. "Who am I speaking with?" The officer's body went rigid. For a moment, he didn't say anything. The arrogance in his stance faltered, just a fraction, as if his brain was scrambling to process what was happening. His gaze flickered to her, suspicion creeping in, but then he straightened, forcing out a chuckle. "Yeah, sure," he said, but there was something weaker in his voice now. "And I'm the president." The woman leaned back in her seat, watching the scene unfold, her fingers drumming lightly against the steering wheel. "You pulled over my wife," the voice on the phone continued, not bothering to acknowledge the officer's sarcasm. "For what reason?" The officer hesitated. It was subtle, but she caught it. He cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Routine stop," he said, his voice sharper now, defensive. "Making sure everything's in order. Nothing wrong with that." Silence. Then, "License plate?" The officer blinked. "What?" "Read me the license plate," Chief Parker said, his voice cold now. "I'll check it myself." A muscle in the officer's jaw twitched. "That's not necessary. License plate, now." The tension in the air had shifted. What had started as a routine abuse of power had flipped into something else entirely. Something the officer no longer had control over. His confidence was cracking, the weight of the situation finally setting in. She could see the moment he realized he had made a mistake. His eyes darted to her car, to her, then to the phone. His fingers curled slightly, his stance turning rigid. His breath was just a little uneven now. And then, another voice entered the conversation, one that didn't come from the phone. A second patrol car had pulled up behind them. Another officer stepped out, younger, his eyes widening slightly as he took in the scene. He had probably just been called in for backup, expecting a routine stop. "Hey, Ryan," the younger officer said, glancing between them. "Everything okay?" Ryan didn't answer. The woman turned her head slightly, catching the younger officer's gaze. "Apparently, Officer Ryan believes I shouldn't be driving in this neighborhood," she said smoothly, "and that my car needs to be searched." The younger officer's brows furrowed. His gaze flickered to Ryan, questioning now. You ran her plates, right?" Silence. The younger cop's expression shifted. He turned toward Ryan, lowering his voice. "Dude," he muttered under his breath, "tell me you ran her plates before calling for backup." Ryan didn't answer. Because he hadn't. Because he had never actually expected this stop to go anywhere beyond intimidation. And now, It had gone too far. The phone was still on speaker. The silence from Chief Parker was deafening. Then, finally, "Officer Ryan," the voice on the phone said, cool and measured. "I expect you in my office first thing tomorrow morning, and bring your badge." Ryan swallowed. The woman leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. She had seen this before, watched men like him abuse their power, thinking there would never be consequences. But there were always consequences. And right now, he was just beginning to feel them. The street had gone eerily silent. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably, glancing between Ryan and the woman in the car. His expression was tight, like he had just walked into a scene he wanted no part of. Ryan, on the other hand, was still frozen. The weight of Chief Parker's words clung to the air like a dense fog, suffocating. His fingers flexed at his sides, his jaw tightening as he struggled to regain control of the situation. But it was slipping. Fast. The woman sat there watching him, her expression unreadable. She didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't revel in his unraveling. She didn't need to. The power balance had already shifted, and Ryan knew it. Then, in a move that was almost comical in its desperation, Ryan straightened his spine and squared his shoulders. His pride wouldn't let him back down so easily. Not in front of his fellow officer. Not in front of her. "You think calling your husband changes anything?" he snapped, his voice sharp but wavering at the edges. "This is still a lawful stop. You—" But the woman tilted her head slightly, her gaze piercing. "A lawful stop?" she echoed, her voice smooth, almost amused. Ryan faltered. She leaned forward, resting her elbow on the car door. "Tell me, Officer Ryan, what was your probable cause?" His mouth opened, then shut. The younger officer exhaled quietly through his nose, shifting again, clearly realizing just how deep Ryan had dug himself. "She's got a point, man," the younger officer muttered under his breath. Ryan shot him a glare, but the damage was done. The doubt was setting in, not just in Ryan, but in everyone watching, because there were people watching now. Cars had slowed down, pedestrians lingering on the sidewalk. Some had their phones out, recording. The situation had evolved from an abuse of power into something much more dangerous for Ryan, a public spectacle. The woman's fingers drummed lightly on the steering wheel. "Here's what's going to happen," she said, her voice still infuriatingly calm. "You're going to give me back my license and registration. You're going to step away from my car, and you're going to hope my husband is feeling generous enough to only take your badge and not your entire career." Ryan scoffed, though it came out weaker than intended. He was still clinging to control, but it was slipping through his fingers like sand. "You don't give the orders here," he snapped. But even as he said it, his hands twitched toward his belt, toward her documents. The woman sighed, as if she were dealing with a particularly stubborn child. "You're right," she said. "I don't. But he does." And as if on cue, a sleek black SUV pulled up behind the patrol cars. The engine barely made a sound, but the presence it carried was deafening. Ryan stiffened. The younger officer muttered, "Oh shit." The SUV door opened, and out stepped Chief Parker himself. He wasn't in uniform, but he didn't need to be. The authority radiated from him like heat off the pavement. His expression was unreadable, his movements measured as he shut the car door behind him and adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket. The crowd had gone dead silent. Ryan swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his sides. The younger officer took a subtle step back, as if already trying to distance himself from what was about to happen. Parker didn't say a word at first. He simply walked up to his wife's car, his gaze flicking over her before landing on Ryan with a weight that could crush mountains. Ryan tried to find his voice. "Sir, Parker held up a single finger. Ryan immediately shut his mouth. The silence stretched unbearably. Parker exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You pulled over my wife," he said, voice dangerously quiet. "You harassed my wife, and when she asked for a reason, you didn't have one." Ryan's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Sir, I didn't know that she was my wife." Parker cut in smoothly. His eyes were sharp, dissecting. "Tell me, Ryan, would it have mattered?" Ryan opened his mouth, then shut it again, because the answer was no. It wouldn't have mattered. He would have treated any black driver the same way. He just hadn't expected this black driver to have powerful connections. Parker nodded slowly, as if he had just confirmed something to himself. "You're done," he said simply. Ryan's face drained of color. "Sir?" "You're done," Parker repeated, enunciating every word. "Turn in your badge. Clean out your locker. First thing tomorrow morning. I don't want to see you in that precinct ever again." The younger officer's eyes widened, his breath hitching. Ryan stumbled over his words, grasping for anything, any excuse, any way out. "Sir, please, I didn't mean—" But Parker had already turned away. He leaned down to his wife's window, his expression softening just slightly. "You okay?" She smiled, a small, knowing thing. "Always." Parker nodded once, then stood up straight. "Let's go," he said to her, before throwing one last glance at Ryan. "Get out of her way." Ryan stepped back without thinking, his movements jerky, mechanical. He looked like a man who had just realized he was drowning, and no one was coming to save him. The woman put her car into drive. She didn't say another word, didn't even spare Ryan a final glance. She just drove away, smooth and steady, like none of this had ever rattled her. But Ryan would never forget this day, because in the end, it wasn't the badge on his chest that gave him power. It was the way he used it. And now? He had none left. Ryan stood motionless, his fingers trembling slightly at his sides, his world unraveling before him. The badge on his chest, the very thing that had given him power, control, superiority, now felt like a dead weight, dragging him down. The crowd was still there, watching, whispering, recording. His name would be all over the internet before the sun even set. But it wasn't the cameras that terrified him. It was Chief Parker's eyes, cold, unwavering, filled with a silent judgment that cut deeper than any words could. Parker exhaled slowly, his stance still relaxed, but the authority in his presence was undeniable. "Hand it over," he said, his voice quiet but absolute. Ryan blinked, his breath catching in his throat. "Sir, please, hand it over." Ryan swallowed hard. His fingers twitched toward his belt, hovering over his badge. He could feel the weight of every decision he had made, leading up to this moment. The stops he had justified, the people he had dismissed, the power he had wielded without consequence. Until now. His hands were clumsy as he unclipped the badge, the metal suddenly feeling cold against his fingertips. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, his pride screaming at him to fight, to argue, to claw back control. But there was nothing left to grab onto. Defeated, he extended the badge toward Parker. The chief didn't snatch it away, didn't revel in the moment. He simply took it with the same measured calm he had carried through the entire ordeal, like it had never really belonged to Ryan in the first place. The younger officer shifted beside them, his jaw tight, his discomfort obvious. He looked at Ryan, at the badge in Parker's hand, at the still recording phones surrounding them. He had walked into this thinking He was backing up a routine stop. Now, he was witnessing a career ending in real time. Parker studied the badge for a brief moment before shaking his head. "I don't expect to see you in uniform again," he said simply. Ryan's chest rose and fell in uneven breaths, his face pale, his lips pressing into a tight, thin line. Parker took a step back and turned to his wife. "You ready to go?" he asked, his voice losing its edge as he looked at her. She smiled, that same unbothered, knowing smile she had carried through the entire ordeal, and nodded. "Always." Without another word, she slipped into her car and started the engine. The soft purr of the vehicle filled the tense air as she pulled away, smooth and steady, as if none of this had ever affected her. But Ryan felt every second of it. He stood there, feeling the weight of his own downfall sink in, the slow, crushing realization that he had done this to himself. And as the chief walked back toward his own car, as the younger officer shifted uncomfortably beside him, as the crowd continued to whisper and watch, Ryan understood something for the first time. It was never about the badge. It was about how you used it. And now, he had no power left to wield. Ryan stood there, his hands hanging limply at his sides, his badge gone, his authority stripped away in front of everyone. The younger officer beside him shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the crowd, at the recording phones, at the wreckage of what had once been Ryan's confidence. The silence stretched unbearably. No one stepped forward to defend him. No one said a word in his favor. The people who had once laughed at his jokes, nodded along to his orders, or turned a blind eye to his actions. They were all watching him fall, and not a single one was reaching out a hand to catch him. Parker didn't spare him another glance. He simply walked to his car, moving with the same effortless authority he always carried. The moment he shut the door behind him, the tension in the air shifted. Ryan turned slightly, his throat dry, searching for something, anything, to hold on to. But when his eyes met the younger officer's, all he found was quiet disappointment. "You really screwed up, man," the younger cop muttered, shaking his head. Ryan clenched his jaw, but there was no defense left to give. The woman's car disappeared down the street, her taillights glowing red in the distance, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. Ryan exhaled shakily. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. This was never how it was supposed to go. But now, as the weight of the moment pressed down on him, he realized something too late. Power isn't about the badge on your chest. It's about the respect you command. And today, he had lost both. Ryan didn't move for a long time. The street, once just another backdrop for his routine stops, now felt foreign, hostile. He could still hear the murmurs of the onlookers, the whispers spreading like wildfire. His career had unraveled in mere minutes, not because of one mistake, but because of a lifetime of choices finally catching up to him. Parker's SUV was gone. The woman, the one he had underestimated, the one he had tried to intimidate, was gone. She hadn't needed to raise her voice, hadn't needed to fight or beg. She had simply let the truth speak for itself, and that was what destroyed him the most. Ryan exhaled shakily, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his own downfall. The younger officer looked at him one last time before sighing. "Guess you thought no one was watching, huh?" Ryan didn't answer, because the truth was, someone is always watching. Somewhere out there, someone had already uploaded the video. The world would see him not as the enforcer of the law, but as the man who let his own arrogance destroy him. This wasn't just another traffic stop. This was a warning, a reminder that power doesn't protect you from consequences. And for those who still believe otherwise, it's only a matter of time. Have you ever witnessed a moment where justice spoke louder than words? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more powerful stories that need to be told.